Good afternoon. For a panel discussion with myself, Gareth Ward. I'm editor of Print Business Magazine and the associated website printbusiness.co.uk, where we have plenty of content about sustainability and other matters affecting the printing industry. And with me, we have Rachel Aldighieri, Managing Director of the Data Marketing Association, the DMA, and Jonathan Tame, Managing Director of Two Sides. They each have an interest, shall we say, in this whole marketing field and the whole bits and pieces. So without further ado, shall we get on and ask these guys some tough questions about how they see the demand for sustainability growing amongst customers and amongst the print fraternity, particularly as we're going to be required to reach carbon neutral by 2030. So what needs to happen, Jonathan, for that for carbon neutrality to go across the print communication space by that time?
Good afternoon. What an enormous question. Firstly, Gareth, I mean, what I'd almost like to say is, you know, with the impacts of COVID and we go into an economic recession, I was almost a little bit concerned that, like in the last recession, sustainability would become less important for brands and governments. And that definitely appears not to be the case. Governments are determined to progress and really push down now on these problems with climate change, and sustainability is really paramount now for every large brand that we come into contact with. But, you know, the question is, how are we going to reach carbon neutrality by 2030? And there is a lot of things that are going to happen between then. You know, it's not that far away. It is 9 years away. And I think the bit that business needs to understand, and if anyone was watching the last speech with Oliver from Communicis, for the supply chain, for printers, for anyone in the sector, you know, the train is coming down the track. Watch closely, take actions. And the first thing for all organisations is to build your policy, to have a strategy, most importantly, to measure, manage, and reduce your emissions, because at some stage we are probably going to have to offset, balance, whatever word you want to call it, those residual emissions. But every company needs to have a policy, to have a strategy about how they're going to achieve getting their carbon emissions down.
Rachel, do you find that your members are on board with this, or is there an awareness across the agencies that you deal with that this is got to have to happen?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, particularly when we're looking at the suppliers to our industry, the agencies, production, the pressures coming from the clients actually, in a way that is driving that action. There's definitely the awareness. I think, you know, to Jonathan's point, it's a short amount of time and a lot to ask, and I think it's quite an overwhelming ask, you know, particularly for SMEs who won't necessarily have specialist departments and an understanding or expertise of how to get there. So you know, the key thing is really to break it down into some kind of action plan. As Jonathan mentioned, the importance of measuring, knowing where you're starting from to know where you're getting to, and really building that plan into your business plan as an integral part of your business plan. So I think, you know, we're seeing more and more companies do that. And you know, Add Net Zero, perhaps talk about later, is for our industry a really good plan in terms of breaking that down and helping the industry get its head around kind of one step at a time.
Does that mean that you have some kind of advisory panel or some sort of resource where your members can go to get some idea of some of those steps that they have to put into place that Oliver was mentioning, that you need to build the roadmap to find out how to measure emissions at the moment, or how to measure impacts? Is that something you have in place yet, or is
yeah,
that something
we're a part of AdNet Zero, so
you're doing it through that?
The group. I lead one of the groups around events and awards, and then we have our print council, and Jonathan sits on our sustainability hub, I believe, so can probably talk more to that and the work they're doing than I can actually. But you know, that hub's very much focused on the print council, creating, and it's kind of almost this beginner's guide, and then they're looking at glossary and terms, and you know, I think already, you know, this issue, there's a whole raft of different terminology that, you know, what does that mean? So really going back to basics to help our industry first understand and then make that plan, but in a step-by-step way that feels achievable.
Well, Jonathan, I think that was a pass to you to fill us in on some of those.
I've never been so popular, actually, Gareth. I mean, I'm pleased to sit on the DMA sustainability group, also for the Advertising Standards Authority, for BPIF. I mean, really, it's all associations who have members within the print community sector, be they agency, be they printers, are starting to get questions from their members. And most of these organisations, like the DMA, like BPIF, are going to be building a roadmap about how companies within their sector can find information. BPIF are a great example, and I will mention them because of the VMC conference. You know, they're building a roadmap for their members about, you know, what steps can you take, short term, long term, how can you measure the impacts of your business? And they won't have all the answers, but where can you go for advice about how to reduce your emissions, how to reduce your energy consumption, and how to report on what is going to be increasingly required in the future?
What sector is ahead, or what sector is the noisiest and wanting to push ahead with this fastest? Is it magazine publishers? Is it the direct marketing area? Is it out of home? What do you see happening there, Jonathan? Is it which ones are the keenest to be seen to be doing something and putting something in place?
I would say they're all very keen, and I wouldn't say one's further ahead than the other. Actually, for me, Gareth, a lot of this is like a journey. You know, we know where we are now, and we can see, or we can envisage where the end point will be. But along the way, there's going to be a lot of information that needs to come from government. It needs to come from the sector in terms of support that can be provided. I wouldn't say that any one area, be it the print, be it magazines, be it newspapers, are further ahead than the other. In terms of carbon, I think there are a lot of very good things happening at a micro level, individual companies doing individual things, but reporting where required, because the business might be over a certain level. They might be reporting into the government framework or in other ways. But I would say that most associations now understand the need to be providing information, and you know, it's starting to become more and more important for their members.
Rachel, you mentioned the AdNet Zero report, which, from my understanding and reading of it, is compiled by the advertising industry in response and came out almost a year ago now. Can you explain a little bit more about that for some of the people that are unfamiliar with this report and what it means and how it might be implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously it's in response to the need to get to AdNet Zero by 2030. So it sets out a really neat 5-point action plan as to how the industry can reduce its impacts in terms of developing, producing, and running UK advertising. So I can perhaps put a link in the chat actually, but you know, the actions really do cover kind of action one is around getting your house in order, and that's very much focused on kind of your energy use as a company or travel, which is quite incredible when you start looking at the costs that, you know, particularly ad agencies have previously pre-COVID been spending on travel and how they can reduce that. And then action two is around curbing emissions from ad production, and there's a neat scheme called Ad Green that forms part of that, and there's a lot of training involved in that. And then action three is very much about curbing emissions from media planning and buying and distribution. And then action four, which is the action that I'm heavily involved in, is around curbing emissions through events and awards. And actually, just to dwell on that one, it's quite interesting looking particularly at awards and how, you know, there's lots of kind of immediate actions that we can take to reduce our carbon impact, but actually how do we kind of slowly change the behavior of our industry and look at what is effective marketing per se, and how carbon comes into that is very interesting. You know, could we get to a point in 2030 where we will only be awarding campaigns that have zero carbon impact? And obviously that will come back to the promotion of certain products. So it's a really interesting journey. And I know for the DMAs this year, we've introduced the Sustainability Award, and that's very much about showcasing the power of advertising to change behaviours. And then that's actually action 5 of the net zero plan. But how can we really drive the behaviour change over the course of the years in terms of entry requirements? So currently, effectiveness is a big part of winning an award. And as you're bringing in your results each year, we're going to slowly introduce the notion of putting a carbon calculator in there. So you have to put how much carbon your campaign has used, to the point that becomes an essential component of our awards come 2030. So that's about really changing the mentality within the industry as opposed to what good work looks like. And I think that really needs to be embedded as an ethos, and something that I think moving forward more broadly for the industry is super important when we look at things like trust and accountability and customer demands. You know, at the heart of what the DMA is all about, it's about championing a customer first approach and building trust in marketing and data and marketing. And, you know, we know sustainability is a big concern of the broader public, you know, and that is something that will start to affect the way consumers consume and choose the brands they're working with. So all of that is a really important part of our industry. It's, you know, obviously is a broader issue for the planet. We need to make these changes, but I think to understand that we can do those hand in hand with changing our industry for the greater good, essentially, and for driving hopefully more profitable and trusted businesses as well.
So you'll end up with something like a return on carbon investment as well as a return on marketing investment.
Well, yeah, let's see where that goes, but that's the direction of travel.
So you'll also need, therefore, for people to have some measurements of their carbon that they use, and be able to verify that. I think Oliver before us was talking about some of the need to provide evidence of your carbon now. And he mentioned EcoVadis as becoming more and more popular. We see that too in the printing sector. We also see things like membership of B Corp starting to come in. Are the brands that you deal with looking for that type of verification, do you think? Yeah,
I think so. And we're seeing more and more the use of carbon calculators. And I think this is quite an interesting one in that there's so many of them. I think it's almost becoming a little bit overwhelming as to which ones we should be using and what's proving what. You know, interestingly, the IPA Media Futures Group is very much aligned and to the net zero plan, and they've created a media carbon calculator, which, you know, has made great strides and is a really interesting development. Yet still that doesn't incorporate the carbon from a data center, for instance, which you can imagine in our industry is quite a significant part. So, you know, how we're getting there, but there's still more work to do, you know, to be, as you say, truly accountable and have proof points from, you know, to cover everything you're doing. It's a pretty complex kind of set of calculations to be making through when you think of the minutiae of every campaign that's running.
And Jonathan, you're very much involved at this end of counting carbon and drawing up labels, for want of a better term, for the amount of carbon that's been produced. Is there a commonality about how people calculate it and the figures that come out at the end of it, or are people, some people, as Rachel said, are not including the data center. Other people might well be, but certainly in the analog world, is one company's carbon measurement similar to another company's carbon measurement? Are they analogous? Or
I've been
measure different things.
I've been quite involved in carbon reporting, particularly within the paper industry for many years. And, that looks at one element, which is paper. And then you have printers and you can look at your own impact, and that's for printers' impact. And then you can look at what's the advertising agency. I mean, there are many elements. And as Rachel says, it's quite challenging for the industry when you're asked a question, what is the carbon impact of this, that many elements go into it, and there are many ways of calculating those individual elements. So I think, what the advertising industry, them specifically, is doing is quite interesting in terms of Ad Green. It's being able to be transparent and hopefully have some common reporting, but it is still going to be using industry averages from various different places and coming up probably with the average carbon footprint. But I think the one thing that you alluded to there is actually quite important, Gareth, in terms of looking at the boundaries of the assessment, and that decisions aren't necessarily made on, is a media campaign using paper got a lower impact than a media campaign using digital only, because it is actually very difficult to compare those two, and it all comes down to the boundaries of the assessment. What does that assessment actually include? Within paper and print, as an example, it's relatively easy. It's the element for paper and it's the element for print. For a digital campaign, as an example, commonly what's often considered is the carbon footprint of the energy used within the actual transmission of that data, being an email sent or whatever it be. It doesn't look so much at the end of use life of that product and the energy used or the materials used to make the servers and the laptops in the first place. So I think carbon's really important. But I don't think also we should lose sight that it's not all about carbon reduction. It's not all about climate change. Sustainability is actually so much more than that. And I know, you want to come on to that with some of your questions, but it's so much more than carbon measurement alone. So
it's not going to be that easy, if at all possible, to tell brands that if you do this campaign using paper, even if it's using the EnviroMail thing that Webmart come up with, where they measure the impact of actually from the postal bit, from the exit of the printing or the mailing house right the way to the doorstep, and they've worked a calculation on that. So you can get an end-to-end figure for a print campaign, but not. If you try to compare that with a digital campaign, it's not going to work just at the moment.
Well, I think the key thing with all of this is you've got to measure it. So if you can measure it, then you can have discussions with your client along the lines of, okay, this is what the carbon footprint of this campaign is. If you do this, and that might be, filming it in a different place or not having people on site when they film it, there's lots of things which go into that impact. But if you can measure it and you can report what the customer's asking for you for, what is the impact of my campaign? Well, the impact of my campaign is this. But providing you can measure the individual elements, it will help the supply chain have informed discussions with their customers about what can they do to reduce it and what can they do to manage it. And where we're coming back to the point where if we have to get to net zero, the only way you can get to net zero after you've measured it and you've reduced it is at some stage to then also offset or find a way of mitigating those emissions. So, I think we're on a journey. There are lots of different measurements, as Rachel said. None of them are wrong. They might be measuring little individual elements, but at the end of the day, it's about being able to have open and transparent conversations with your customers about this is what the impacts of a digital, a paper, a filming campaign is, and these are our recommendations about how we can help you reduce it. And if you want to go to net zero, this is how we might recommend that you offset it. But as most people will say, offsetting always would be the last recommendation after you've actually measured and reduced those emissions.
So you wouldn't recommend people offsetting, to doing a measurement and doing the offsetting now, but wait till the end, towards the end of the journey?
I think that's up to the client, and that's the client's decision. You know, I know that lots of calculators do give people the choice. This is what the impact is. This is a way you can do it. So I think it's then up to the customer to make those decisions, and up to the supply chain actually to provide those solutions.
So people are sometimes dubious about the benefits of offsetting. Some of the schemes, projects, you know, that are there. You know, you're protecting a forest which is already there, or you're giving somebody some gas stoves in Africa. How do you know that they're going to be using it? Or you've offset by forestry in the northwest of the US, which is all burned down this summer. Is that accurate, or is that a problem? Does that cast dubious light on offsetting?
I think absolutely right, Gareth, that there is some questions asked of offsetting. Does it work? Does it really happen? And I think those questions are going to get more intense as time goes on. There's going to be more scrutiny, and it comes back to, you know, what the guy from Communisys was saying in terms of reporting, in terms of verification, external verification, whoever it might be. Within offsetting, there are so many ways of taking carbon dioxide out the atmosphere. And yes, you need to be very sure when you're looking at any offsetting scheme, it has integrity, it has credibility, it has either verification, or if it doesn't have verification, you seek absolute clarity in terms of how it's done and what the benefits are. But you know, you are absolutely right. And I think as time moves on, there's going to be more and more scrutiny and more demand on offsetting schemes for disclosure about how does it work, and to ensure that there is no double counting and this action actually takes place.
Rachel, do you see that happening from the brands and your members' point of view, that there's some questions around some of these offsetting schemes and some of the actions that they might be taken elsewhere?
Yeah, I think with the offsetting, you know, I don't think we should see it as a bad thing. And sometimes it can be kind of in a holding pattern where you work out your new processes and tech to start measuring carbon. But I think, to Jonathan's point, all eyes are on greenwashing at the moment, aren't they? And I think if you're making claims that you're doing things that you're not, you know, the long term or even short term risk to your brand, as your reputation, is not good. So I think, yes, I think just to solely go down that route would be a mistake for sure. But I think as a kind of you've done everything you possibly can, and you need to offset at the end, as Jonathan said. I think that's an option and something to start. While you're on your path to getting where you need to be, it's certainly something that should be included in the mix, but it's definitely not the sole solution to this. This isn't going to tackle climate change by itself. It needs to be in conjunction with reducing carbon. So
while we're there, I mean, we're reducing carbon. What other things can we do to enhance the sustainability of the communications sector?
I think we need to be a little bit careful that carbon doesn't become the only conversation in town. Sustainability is about so much more than that. You know, one of the words that we often hear these days are we need to live in a truly circular economy. You know, it starts with reducing the resources, particularly the finite resources, not the natural renewable ones, but the finite resources we have, the ability to recycle products and then to be able to reuse them. And so often, particularly within our industry, sustainability starts with design. So for agencies, in terms of creating products for brands which use the minimum amount of resources that can be easily recovered, recycled and reused. And it's not just about carbon, it's about so much more than that. But I think, right here and now the focus is on carbon and will remain so, but sustainability is about just getting into the circular economy and making sure everything we do is as circular as possible.
Yeah, we've noticed from the direct mail side of things that printers and mailing houses have been switching rapidly to using envelopes, paper envelopes, rather than film wrap rapidly. So I guess that's happening on your side of that part of your side of things, Rachel, as well. People are using more sustainable methods of reaching people.
And I think also going back to kind of the 101 of direct marketing is around targeting and reducing waste. So, as data usage becomes so much more sophisticated and efficiencies are built into processes with AI and the likes, data is a real driver of those efficiencies and can lead to more sustainable marketing as well. So I think, let's not forget those basics and the fundamentals of marketing that can help us be more efficient more broadly as well.
Reduce waste. Guys, we've come to the timeout section of the day. We've reached the end. We could carry on talking about this, I'm sure, for another hour easily. It'll be fascinating for us and fascinating for the audience, I'm sure, but they're going to find some other more fascinating conversations to listen to and take part in. So do I see any questions? I don't really. I didn't expect any because of the nature of this presentation. But I'd like to thank Rachel, I'd like to thank Jonathan, and thank you for attending and listening and being alert. And hopefully you've got some ideas about where the sustainability journey can start. So thank you very much to my panelists. Thank you for watching. Thank you.
Thanks, Gareth.
Thank you.